So thank you very much. This is the second panel of the second session of the panel on Shifting South, Governance of Regional Value Chains, Social Standards, and COVID-19. So we have three sessions. The first one was yesterday, where we largely discussed private governance, as well as we started discussing about public governance and the role of the state. But that is going to come more prominently today. And most of the papers are on aspects of labor, gender, decent work, and a combination of the role of the state, firms, and civil society. So again, we see an intertwining of private, public, and social governance in global and regional value chains, as well as there's some work today as well on domestic value chains, as we will see. In the global south. We can start now. The first presentation is by Peter Lou Thompson, Uzma Remen, and Søren Jepsen from the Copenhagen Business School on women's entrepreneurship in the bamboo value chains in India. So I leave the floor to you, Peter. Thank you.
Hi, Giovanni. Thanks. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Well.
Okay, and yeah, I'm also seeable, right? My head is not cut off halfway or something like that. It sometimes happens.
We can see you.
Thanks, Scarlett. Very good. All right. So this is a paper that is now tentatively titled "Public Governance of Value Chains?" Upgrading of women-owned micro-enterprises in India's bamboo industry. It's a paper that's written together with Uzma Remen, my wife, who's also at Copenhagen Business School, and my colleague Søren, who is also joining us in this session. So briefly talk about the introduction, theoretical considerations, context and methodology, empirical findings and conclusions of this paper. Okay, now this way, I guess. So we had a puzzle for this paper. So back in 2018, Uzma, Søren, and we were hired as kind of consultants to an Indian NGO called the Foundation for MSME Clusters that is located in New Delhi. So they were going to implement a large-scale project aimed at promoting the bamboo industry in India. And as a result of that, we got involved in a study on women's micro enterprises in various parts of India and the prospects for them to operate in the Indian bamboo value chain. So we started out that project by trying to find out a puzzle. I mean, what was the key problem we wanted to address in our study? So one thing was we started out actually conducting a market study here in the capital of Denmark, Copenhagen, and found out that there was a lot of demand for bamboo-based products like, bamboo straws, bamboo t-shirts, bamboo baskets, and other things that were sold by retailers like H&M, IKEA, and others. And literally, so these different outlets here were selling, products, bamboo-related products made in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. So there was a massive demand for sort of bamboo-based products here, and not only, I'm sure, in Copenhagen, but also in the UK and elsewhere. So at the same time, we were then in India and started interviewing various stakeholders in India and found out there's a very, very supportive legislation in India through various government ministries and various laws and state agencies that aim at boosting sort of the upgrading of micro enterprises that are owned by women in India. And we found out that most of the micro enterprises also operate at the local level. And when we then went out into different villages and towns in India and asked them, so what about your products? And they said, well, there's very little demand for our products and we get very low prices. So then we were wondering if it is indeed the case, that there are millions of these bamboo-based products being sold in the global north, then why do women-owned micro enterprises not sell their products sort of in larger quantities and at higher prices than they currently do in local value chains in India? So the context in India is that India, in terms of area coverage, is the second largest bamboo producer in the world. Bamboo is a product that's produced in at least 18 different states in India, and it's considered increasingly a sort of a sustainable alternative to other raw materials such as plastic or cotton. It can be used in the production of clothes, of everyday items, of furniture, of everyday sort of items for home use, etc. So there's a very big potential for expanding bamboo production worldwide. However, if you look at India, there's very little export from India, and mostly bamboo-based products are sold in local value chains, especially handicrafts. There are, however, some more sophisticated markets, you can say, in Delhi and in some of the national capitals of individual states, but exports is quite limited. Production is primarily dominated by women artisans and sort of women-owned micro-enterprises that are primarily involved in the primary processing of bamboo. That is, after bamboo has been cut from the forest or plantations, they started actually then doing the next stages in production and turning these into some usually quite small products. And as I said before, both at the national level and also at state level, there's very extensive legislation and government support for this industry. So then we were trying to understand here, all right, how do we then understand upgrading of these women-owned micro-enterprises? So we said, from the viewpoint of value chain analysis, I mean, we could probably employ traditional concepts such as private governance, upgrading, and institutional contextual analysis, given the huge diversity within India, which in itself is almost, I mean, if not larger than Europe, but certainly population-wise, is much larger than Europe, with around almost 30 different states that could be thought of as countries in their own right. Then we were also thinking we need to look at the role of the Indian government in promoting the upgrading of these enterprises. So thinking about the work of Horner and others, we came up with this categorization. Why don't we think about the role of the Indian state as a facilitator, a regulator, a producer, and a buyer in this value chain? We then asserted that scale matters. So it's not, you cannot think about the role of the state in itself in the context of India without thinking about scales. So you need to think about the scale of the sort of what levels of analysis does the state operate at, national, state, and local levels. Space also matters, given the fact that between the national capital and even state capital and villages throughout India, you literally have very large distances. So some of the surprising aspects to us this was that some of these bamboo micro-enterprises are in remote areas that are, in some areas and some places, especially in the Northeast, are almost never visited by state officials. So almost outside the remit of the state. So in that way, there's a kind of a regulatory gap, the linkage between the state in itself and its various sort of enforcement agencies and these micro-entrepreneurs. There's kind of a gap. So we thought about introducing the concept of regulatory intermediaries to understand how such intermediaries, defined as any actor that acts directly or indirectly in conjunction with a regulator to affect the behavior of the target, in this case, women's micro enterprises in this industry, how do these types of intermediaries translate rules, assist in implementation of government legislation, create dialogues between the state and these women-owned enterprises, and how do these intermediaries then feedback information from the ground level up to state officials? So we thought that, you know, you can actually combine value chain analysis, understanding the role of the state, with analysis of regulatory intermediaries and seeing how they function with the aim of helping the upgrading of these enterprises. However, we also felt that based upon our experience in different parts of India and doing this field work, that there were a lot of contextual constraints. So, you know, the differences across India are sometimes vast, and that regulatory intermediaries cannot necessarily use the same type of models for translating rules and regulations into meaningful action at the ground level across different geographical areas. There's also sometimes limitations. We found out that, you know, the assumption that regulatory intermediaries such as NGOs or state level extension agencies, that they can simply help upgrade these women-owned enterprises, that there are real limitations in many areas with some of the women having very little education in the formal sense. Reading and writing can be a real issue. So there's some limitations to the kinds of, for example, the understanding of production processes, use of machinery and other things that might be challenging. And there's also some areas a very big distrust between some women artisans and also some of their micro enterprises and state level officials, conflicts between sort of state forestry departments and these bamboo producer communities. Now, let me see. Okay, a very simplified version of the Indian bamboo value chain looks like this. So first bamboo is harvested, it's then processed primarily by these women. Then secondary processing, they're undergoing in maybe sort of smaller workshops, then picked up by traders and collectors and sold to consumers. There are various outlets there, but for these women-owned enterprises, mostly sort of, maybe weaving a small rug or making a basket and selling it out sort of in the local market in a nearby town. So our fieldwork concentrated on 4 different states. One was Madhya Pradesh in the center of India. Then we looked at what is now called Odisha in the east, and we went to northeast Assam and Meghalaya. These represented sort of some of the biggest producer regions of India and bamboo. We started out our fieldwork in 2019 with 3 trips where we conducted 40 interviews in Delhi, Assam, Meghalaya, Madhya Pradesh, and Odisha with government officials, NGOs, artisans, women entrepreneurs, etc. And then we started the second round of fieldwork here in fall 2020 and spring 2021. We couldn't personally travel, but we were working with various field offices of the Foundation for MSME Enterprises or enterprise clusters in India that helped us conduct interviews with women micro-entrepreneurs. So what did our analysis then show? Well, if we want to understand why there's such a massive global demand for bamboo-based products and why these Indian women micro-entrepreneurs are not able to sell more and get better sort of prices for their products, one of the big things we saw in India was that there's actually a lack of private sector value chain governance. So you're having a situation where you're having distant artisans and women having their micro enterprises in distant villages or even in towns. They lack information about latest product design, latest ways of manufacturing. They don't know about prices. So there's basically a complete disconnect. Yes, Giovanni, what's my
5 minutes?
5 minutes, we're almost there. Okay. So they're sitting in a sense in an isolated sense, and you don't have that kind of integrated types of value chains that we would typically often assume in private sort of sector value chain governance studies. There's also another thing. So when we went out and asked them in certain villages, can you produce how many bamboo baskets can you produce? Say, okay, maybe we can do 300 in this village. Then we would ask them, what about if you need to produce 300,000 items? Can you do that? And they would say, no, not at all, never. So there's an issue about production scale and lack of ability to perform the same types of manufacture the same types of products. So basically, it's a question of lack of factories being present at the ground level. And also there's a big issue in different areas of India with accessing the right types of bamboo raw materials on time. And here the state has control a lot of sort of the selling of bamboo once it goes beyond household consumption level. And it's apparently not doing a very good job in terms of both growing bamboo and selling it to women micro-entrepreneurs. So the state both helps in India in terms of facilitating the upgrading for various support programs. They regulate access to bamboo. They also produce in terms of producing in forest and selling bamboo products, and they also buy through government emporium in different cities. The intermediaries that we studied, they help, in a sense, build the capacity or help upgrade these micro enterprises, help women, for example, calculate costs, wages, and profits of their enterprises, help them obtain access to state grants, loans, and training, take them exposure visits to new markets, and help them actually produce against what is in demand in terms of product design, etc. However, there are several issues that they also face. Some of the women are not willing to work part-time. They're only interested in we're not willing to work full-time. They only want to work part-time. They are often involved in multiple livelihood activities and seasonal production, which means that they don't always sort of want to produce all year round. There's often gender-based access issues. For example, in one state, we heard that there was the idea that the men should be going to the jungle to pick up the bamboo because they would be better equipped sort of to handle situations facing tigers and elephants, wild elephants. And there's also some gendered nature of access to finance, land, and property ownership in India, which makes it difficult to grow their enterprises. So in terms of conclusions, Right, so there are some real limits to public governance in India in terms of enabling an economic upgrading of women-owned micro-enterprises. Regulatory intermediaries, they have potential, but they face diverse contextual challenges throughout the country. There's a need for actually increasing private sector governance of the chain, linking up different actors throughout India to create better market and sort of production linkages. So in terms of theoretical implications, I suppose one implication of the paper is that maybe we need to think more carefully what we mean when we talk about regional value chains. Is regional something that is above the level of the state, or is that below the level of the state if we think of a country such as India? There's also this thing that in regional value chains, if we think about that at the subnational level in India, you don't often have many lead firms there. So we cannot think about governance perhaps in the private sector in quite the same way. And also we think that this paper calls for increased focus then on the role of intermediaries and intermediation in the value chain. You know, we can't just look at the role of the state in isolation when we need to look at enforcement of legislation and capacity building of enterprises. We need to sort of increase our focus on these intermediaries. Yeah, so that was it.
Perfect, Peter. Thanks a lot, and exactly on time, just 10 seconds before the 15 minutes. That was brilliant. Thanks for the very interesting presentation. The role of regulatory intermediaries, the state, NGO, state agency in supporting bamboo workers and women, supporting scaling up in India. So now 5 minutes for questions. I can see there's already one in the chat. Stephanie, do you want to ask it directly?
What about social governance? Yes, so in a sense, social governance, you can maybe think of that as coming in with some of these intermediaries, Stephanie, that you have a lot of NGOs or even consultancies helping to organize not only bamboo producers, but also local artisans in other industries as well. So for example, we didn't engage with SEVA in this research because we were already linked up to the FMC Foundation that had local staff around India. So I think definitely social governance could also be thought about it, but then we have to see it in relation to intermediaries, I think. Yeah. Okay, what do I mean by regional value chains? What do we mean that being below or above the state? Okay, so how do you define a region? A region is that South Asia, it's some sort of an amalgamation of, or what do you call it, a group of countries together. Is that what constitutes a region? Or is it, in a sense, a region is that something that's below the level of the state? So for example, in Northeast India could be considered to be a region, or South India, or Central India. So what is a region? And what is a regional value chain? Is that, I mean, at what scale is it? How do we define that term?
Any other questions? Please feel free to unmute yourself. Oh, sorry, were you saying something? Sorry.
Yeah, just adding to what Peter said, it's sort of here we're trying to get at the regional in the, shall we call it, below the state level. I guess one of the challenges conceptually will be that when we're there specifically and geographically, as we've discovered, and I think that Peter alluded to in the presentation, is that you have these vast differences also between the states. So we need to figure out how to move beyond just that, okay, we have a lot of differences from one state to the other, and what then? Can we get closer to these differences, and what are the implications there for regional, meaning as a state subnational level? Thanks.
Yeah, so Khalid, you're asking, and you have also worked in India many times. So at self-help groups, are some of these women organized in self-help groups? Yes, some of them are, but a lot of them are not. At least that's my clear. I think there's a real need for organizing. But one thing is, so the typical thing we saw in this sector is that you have extension agencies and NGOs, foundations going out to train. Even if producers are organized in self-help groups, they might receive training in the product that nobody knows whether it's in demand or not, right? So there's this focus on building production capacity, But in a sense, for this to work out, you need to have a buyer, and you need to have a buyer to come in and help specify, you know, what types of products do we need, what design is needed, what is the pricing, when do we need these products, etc.
Well, I mean, I do think there is a issue that we're going to get, you know, when firstly.
Can I please ask you to mute yourself if you are not speaking, so that, yeah, thank you. That's brilliant. Okay, if there are no other pressing questions, I suggest we move on to the second presentation, and then we can come back to this also later on during the discussion. I forgot to mention briefly before that this session is hosted, the panel, by Professor Stephanie Barrientos and Professor Khalid Navi for the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester, Dr. Matthew Alford from the Alliance Business School, also at the University of Manchester, and myself, who is a research associate at the GDI. Another technical aspect that you pretty much have figured out yourself is you can put questions in the chat. It's better if you can ask them yourself and reveal your face, that's brilliant. But if you prefer just write it on the chat here, that's fine. And the presenter can read it there. So the next presentation is by Florian Schäfer at the Open University and Carlos Oya at SOAS. And it is on the politics of labor relations and agency in global production networks, specifically the case of Ethiopia Apparel. I know they also recently published a paper on work development, which is extremely interesting, and I would recommend to everybody. But with no further ado, I leave the floor to Florian, I guess. Yes. Thank you.
Unmute. There we go. Sorry about that. Am I now unmuted? Yes, very good.
Yes,
great.
Well. Thank you.
Lovely. Sorry about that. After all this online teaching. Thank you very much, everybody, and especially the organizers of this fantastic panel and stream. What I'll be presenting today is joint work with Carlos Oya, who's also with us today. And I'll be talking to you about the politics of labor relations in global production networks, in particular about collective action industrial parks and local conflict in the Ethiopian apparel sector. So obviously, as you all know, global manufacturing is increasingly organized via global production networks. What this means for labor is that the conditions and outcomes for workers depend on their inclusion, the conditions of their inclusion into such global production networks. And we also know that the agency of workers, both inside and outside the workplace, plays an important role, excuse me, in shaping conditions in supplier firms. So what we did in this paper is we wanted to ask how the new labor regimes and conditions of employment actually get set up in the first place. So we asked what factors drive a labor conflict and worker resistance in new and emerging export manufacturing sectors, and what implications do such conflicts have for working conditions. And we illustrate this by looking at the encounters between international firms and local workers in the Ethiopian apparel sector. The paper is out now. I'll put a link here for you if anybody would like to read it. I'll be galloping through the contents of this paper at fairly high speed, and obviously I've only been able to pick out a couple of sort of key themes, so there's a lot more detail in the actual paper itself. So what I wanted to talk to you today is two contributions that the paper makes, one on the theoretical side and one on the empirical side. So on the theoretical side, we bring in a lot of work from labor studies and employment relations into the analysis of labor outcomes in global production networks. So I'll tell you a little bit about our approach in that respect. And then in terms of empirical findings, we of course focus on strikes and other forms of collective mobilization. Excuse me. But importantly, we also argued that labor conflict can't be read off from production networks in a simple manner. And we highlight the role in particular of local political conflicts and how these impact labor relations and labor struggles. And we also want to go beyond organized forms of resistance to look at less organized and more individual resistance and struggles by workers. And so we look at, in particular, at struggles over effort and mobility. So how do we go about analyzing labor conflict in GPNs? We do this by combining labor process theory, mobilization theory, and GPN analysis. So we use the concept of labor regimes to look at how factors inside and outside of the factory can help explain differences across workplaces. Labor regimes themselves draw on labor process theory, which looks closely at the interrelations of labor market segmentation and workforce mobilization. How this interrelates with the conditions of employment, but also with forms of enterprise and authority that are necessary for the appropriation of surplus value. We think about these labor regimes in a dialectic of structure and agency, and here we in particular draw on Eric Olin Wright's work on structural and associational power. But we also recognize that different forms of labor mobilization and resistance do, of course, relate to different combinations of workplace and marketplace structural power, but they also importantly depend on perceptions of injustice and opportunity. So we bring in Kelly's work on mobilization theory here. And then lastly, to understand less organized forms of resistance, we draw on Smith's work on mobility and effort struggles, which result from the double indeterminacy of labor. So the idea that the amount of work and effort is not actually fixed in labor contracts, but results from bargaining in the workplace. Our analytical framework tries to mobilize this across 3 different scales. So firstly, we look at the micro level of direct workplace encounters between workers and employers over issues such as wages, safety, productivity, effort, and labor time. Secondly, we look at the characteristics of a particular sector or set of global production networks, if you want. And so in apparel, what's really important is the double profit and sourcing squeeze, which means that firms that are linked into demanding global production networks may have to impose harsher and more intrusive methods of labor control in order to remain profitable. But on the other hand, it also means that governments that are competing to attract such GPN-linked manufacturers may be forced to create suitable conditions for such sector-specific forms of labor control. And then the third level we look at is the level of the national political economy. And here in particular, we focus on state-society relations, which shape labor supply dynamics and the arenas of labor struggles. And that, of course, includes labor market institutions. A very brief note on our data. So we combine a large-scale survey with in-depth qualitative work. In 2017 and 18, we interviewed over 500 workers across 25 leading apparel companies. So we specifically selected enterprises that were leading the sector in terms of employment and export performance. And in parallel, we conducted 150 in-depth qualitative interviews with workers, managers, trade union representatives, government officials, and other key informants. So that's the empirical basis that we draw on. A little bit of background on the Ethiopian apparel sector before we move on to findings. So for those of you unfamiliar with the Ethiopian case, Ethiopia has, over the last decade and a half maybe, embarked on an ambitious industrialization strategy built around a space-based and very active industrial policy that aims to attract foreign direct investment as the lead engine of industrialization. It therefore offers an interesting case study into how new export-oriented manufacturing sectors get established. The strategy is space-based in the sense that in order to streamline service provision to firms, but also to help attract and concentrate new industrial labor forces, the industry in Ethiopia is concentrated in a series of new industrial parks, most of which are owned and operated by the government, but there are some private parks as well. So let's look briefly at the 3 main actors in this: the state, capital, and labor. The state at the federal level plays a leading role in coordinating FDI and managing the industrial parks, but the policy is much less coherent at subnational levels, and as we'll see later, there's even conflictual relations between subnational parts of the state who disagree politically with central authorities, excuse me. In terms of capital, we've seen a few waves of investors, but the most recent wave, which is what we're mostly concerned with here, arrived after 2014 and is dominated by companies that are integrated into well-known and therefore demanding apparel GPNs, and those are mostly moving into government-owned industrial parks. In terms of the workforce, the apparel workforce in Ethiopia has 4 basic features. Most workers are young women who have migrated internally, and they have comparatively high levels of education for the jobs that they fill. So most companies only hire people who have either 8 or 10 years of schooling. Moving on to findings very rapidly. In terms of looking at strikes and constraints on collective action, there is an idea that as manufacturing production is increasingly fragmented across the globe, we see a global quiescence in terms of lower union densities and less collective action. However, Ethiopia very much doesn't conform to this pattern at all. Strikes in Ethiopia are very, very common. 38% of the workers we sampled reported having witnessed a strike in the last 12 months, and almost all of the firms that we looked at had experienced a strike in the last 12 months. Most strikes are about wages, but they're also in particular international firms about conflicts such as the mistreatment of workers by managers, or conflicts over the provision of services such as canteen food or transportation, for instance. Low wages result from a combination of sectoral pressures and misplaced government recommendations about what would constitute acceptable base wages. We can talk more about that in question and answers, maybe. We also observed a widespread anti-union animus on both the part of firms, although not all firms, and the government, and that combined with very restrictive labor laws means that most strikes in the sector were wildcat, i.e. they weren't formally organized by a trade union. And industrial parks, where unions are discouraged but not formally banned, emerged as spaces of particularly intense contestation. So just to briefly show you what I mean, the panel on the left here shows unionization rates in a series of industrial parks and outside of the parks. So what you can see is that unionization rates are much lower inside of parks than they are outside of parks. But the panel on the right shows the incidence of worker-reported strikes. And here we see that strikes are much more common inside of industrial parks than they are outside of industrial parks. And again, these industrial parks host only foreign companies, many of whom are tied into leading global production networks for apparel. As I said before, we argue, though, that direct conditions in the workplace aren't the only drivers of labor conflicts. And in fact, if you look at the Ethiopian case, you see that the recent acceleration of strikes coincided with a particularly tumultuous period in Ethiopian politics. There were a lot of political tensions and huge mass protests that began in 2014, escalated in 2016, and ultimately brought down the government. What we saw was that in particularly large foreign flagship companies, those that have high public profiles were targeted for strikes. So on the one hand, that makes a lot of sense because such firms are more likely to want to avoid reputational damage insofar as they have their own brands or are directly supplying brand manufacturers. But on the other hand, targeting such firms also boosts the visibility of local political actors and has high symbolic value given the close identification of the federal government in Ethiopia with a strategy of FDI-led industrialization. And we saw that at least 2 very large strikes in 2018 and 2019 in 2 different industrial parks were directly influenced and in part driven by local political conflicts. Interestingly, we also saw that over time, some subnational authorities started increasingly siding with workers in a conflict, in their conflicts with employers. And this was driven by ethnic fragmentation of the Ethiopian polity, which increasingly saw subnational actors working against the federal government, in particular from 2016 onwards. Brilliant. Almost done. Thank you very much. Moving on to issues over effort and mobility. We argue in this paper that non-organized forms of resistance by individual workers can have at least as important an impact on labor relations as actual strikes. So as we've seen, the incidence of strikes in Ethiopia is very significant, but exit, i.e. workers leaving their jobs or being unavailable for recruitment, is actually the most widespread form of resistance. So high turnover affects both domestic and foreign firms, but is a much more serious concern in foreign firms. On the one hand, these firms are younger, they've had less time to adapt to local conditions, but on the other hand, those are also precisely the companies that are tied into the most demanding global production networks. The According to interviews with workers and trade union officials, high rates of absenteeism and turnover are direct responses to low wages. And in particular, workers' expectations of stable wages that were sufficient to cover living expenses were frequently not met. So there's a huge mismatch of expectations there. We also observed, though, that if you look at the level of the industrial park, all industrial parks experience similar levels of turnover. But if you drill down and look at the level of the firm, you actually see substantial variation across different firms. So this suggests that turnover is not simply related to membership in a particular global production network, but is also related to issues in particular factories. And we saw very different responses to these from different factory managers in response to different levels of pressure from workers. So in conclusion, when this sector first emerged, both investors and the Ethiopian government expected to find a pliant and large labor force willing to work for low wages. However, new labor regimes, which are, as we've argued, necessary for the profitable insertion into demanding global production networks, are of course co-constituted and contested by workers. And as we've seen, this new sector has already seen a large wave of collective and individual resistance from workers, driven in part, of course, by grievances over wages and non-wage working conditions. However, these conflicts were sharpened by the suppression of trade union activity in most, but not all, industrial parks and forms. And as we've also argued, industrial strife as it happened on the ground ultimately resulted from a complex interplay of factory-based grievances and political mobilization against the national government. And we think that these factors are very important when analyzing how labor conflict occurs in global production networks and what the potential consequences might be. So the result of all of this are very unstable and highly localized politics of production that are structured but not determined by the dynamics of global production networks and the strategic aims of national political actors. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Florian, for the very interesting presentation, being within the time. And if I can suggest, you mentioned at the beginning the paper that this presentation is linked to, maybe if you can post a link in the chat for everybody so that everybody can access it.
Sure, I'll do that in a minute, no problem.
Yeah, thank you. And I know we have 5 minutes for questions. I can already see there is one. Shane, do you want to ask it directly?
Yes, thank you, Gio, and thank you for a really interesting presentation. And I'm particularly interested in your use of the concept of labor regimes. But what I wanted to ask about, I mean, you spoke briefly about the your sample as including a large proportion of firms that were foreign owned and then some that were Ethiopian owned. Did you stratify your sample by that? Because I mean, is there a labor regime that is uniform across the Ethiopian garment sector? Is there a labor regime that is peculiar to an industrial park, or does one find different sort of factory regimes that will be determined a lot by nationality of owners and senior managers of the factory? You've looked at a number of variables feeding into your findings, but you haven't looked at that. Thanks.
Carlos, do you want to take this or shall I?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I think as Florian said, a key aspect that distinguishes different factory regimes is being in the industrial park, and particularly being connected to one of the most demanding global production networks. So to be clear, the different what we call foreign firms, have different origins, includes mostly firms from Asia, but also firms from Turkish origin, which were, coming from the initial wave into the Ethiopian apparel sector. And the short answer is no, they're not distinct labor regimes by nationality. So there are quite striking similarities which are related to the particular global production networks in which they inserted across, for example, firms that have, Chinese ownership compared to Indian, Sri Lankan ownership. But we did find, for example, some interesting variations even within ownership. For example, we have a significant sample of firms with Chinese ownership, and there was quite a striking variation among some of them, particularly the biggest flagship firms versus the smaller firms, and whether they were inserted in some of these global production networks or not. The Ethiopian leading companies, they are quite different in the sense that they have a well-established labor force, workers who are older, a much longer tenure, much higher union density, so clearly operate with distinct labor regimes, and most of them are not incorporated in these global production networks. Does that respond to your question?
Yes, thanks very much.
Thank you.
I can see, Stephanie, you want to ask your question.
Yeah, I would just, no, thank you, very interesting paper. I look forward to reading it. I just want to know more about the gender dimension. As you say, the majority of workers are women, relatively well educated, but seriously underpaid for and undervalued. But you said that a lot of the organisation or the militancy is outside the unions. So my question really relates to just more information on the gender dimensions. Do women organise women? Are women involved in the leadership? I know that sexual harassment is said to be a big issue, certainly in some factories, and I just wondered whether you found this. And also what role women play in the sort of wildcat type strikes. So presumably these are largely women workers who are organising outside of the union. So just a bit more on the gender side, given the important role women play.
Florian, you want to say something, or shall I start?
Sure. I can say some things.
Yeah. Go on.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. So first of all, the labor force is very segmented by gender. So we see that women dominate, in particular, the lowest paid positions. And when it comes to supervisory roles, suddenly you find that half the workers are men. So there's quite a lot of sort of sexism in the way that that in the internal segmentation of these labor markets. Women are definitely underrepresented in the leadership of formal trade unions, but as you just suggested, because of their much greater role in the overall labor force, they also play a more important role at grassroots. But certainly the senior levels of union leadership tend to be dominated by men as well. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there. We did ask about issues such as sexual harassment, and it is a very widespread problem. It's also becoming a problem in the retention of workers, and in workers not being available for recruitment in the first place. So the parks started getting a really bad reputation. It wasn't, interestingly, just sort of sexual harassment in the workplace, which is definitely a massive and widespread problem, but also the safety of women on the way into and out of the factories. Because suddenly these were, in particular in settings outside of Addis Ababa, you had comparatively small towns that suddenly had very large numbers of young women, and that attracted some crime and violence, unfortunately, as well.
Just wanted to add a couple of points. First, as Florian said, the role of women in, for example, organizing strikes, according to most of the qualitative interviews, was not that significant. It was primarily, dominated in terms of the so-called instigators from the manager's point of view, mostly male. However, on what we call individual resistance over effort, mobility, being available for recruitment, on that element, women are clearly very, very active, and particularly in relation to the questions of harassment and safety issues. This is particularly important in Hawassa Industrial Park, where women had to commute in the very early hours in the morning. That became a major issue that really pushed them out of the parks, out of these jobs, and that has raised interesting debates among policy officials, but also enterprises, in relation to the question of housing, and whether industrial parks or enterprises themselves should organize dormitories so that these issues of safety, harassment, etc., would be tackled. That is an issue that has not been resolved yet, and the Ethiopian government has been quite resistant to dormitory labor regimes of the kind you find in China. But these things might change precisely because of the issues that we've analyzed in this paper.
Thank you very much, Carlos and Florian. I'm aware of the time. There are some interesting questions by Sheba, Matthew, and a comment by Søren, which revolve around the concept of labor resistance, why it happened in Ethiopia, not in other countries, and the leverage points used by labor resistance to target not just suppliers, but lead firms. So maybe we can park this for now and go back to this during the final conversation, because they are very interesting questions. So the next presenter is Sheba Tayani and Sakiko Fakuda-Par with a paper on gender and COVID-19, workers in global value chains. So Sheba, I think you're presenting, right? Can I share my screen? Yes.
Okay, I hope everyone can see this. Okay, so it's great to be here. Thank you all for the very interesting papers that we've already heard. So I'm going to be talking to you about my paper on gender and COVID-19 workers in global value chains. As Giovanni said, this is a co-authored paper with Sakiko Fukuda-Par, who unfortunately could not be here today. So our paper is, of course, on COVID-19, which we all are now painfully aware is a two-pronged crisis, global health emergency, as well as an economic crisis. So we present in our paper a framework to analyze the effects of COVID-19 in terms of both these dimensions on workers. So our framework analyzes the gendered effects on workers in the low value added segments of global value chains. We differentiate between the health and lockdown effects of the pandemic to identify the types of risks that workers face, and also further between the supply disruption and demand contraction channels. And we do this across the sites of production and social reproduction, locating the gendered norms and institutions that mediate these impacts. We compare the effects across three sectors: garments, electronics, and business process outsourcing, which is a segment of the IT sector and includes, enterprise resource management, call centers, HR, things like that. These chains also have different structures of governance and employment, and we use them in order to contextualize the impact of the shock on workers. So we build this framework drawing on 2020 data from rapid surveys, from media reports, reports put out by businesses, trade unions, and civil society organizations. And of course, the caveat is that the pandemic is still ongoing, and there are many other axes of inequality aside from gender that are important. We do look at some of them, but our main focus is gender. So our work builds on a feminist analysis of gender, work, and crises. So we draw on this sort of foundational analysis and incorporate that into our framework. So I will illustrate these foundations by getting into the framework right away, because we are, we have less time. So this is our general framework for the analysis of COVID-19 on workers in global value chains. And like other feminist analyses have done, we place well-being at the center of our considerations. So we don't look only at things like employment and income, but rather, a larger multidimensional view of the impact of the pandemic on workers. We also look not only at the sphere of production, but also the sphere of social reproduction, which includes all the unpaid work that is done to produce and reproduce human capital and labor. And as I said earlier, we divide, or we sort of separate our analysis into the impacts of health through the health channel as well as the lockdown channel. And I'll talk about each in turn. So in the health channel, of course, workplace contagion in the productive sphere has led to illnesses of workers during the pandemic, which has impacted social reproduction by a decline in income and a rise in care work, particularly for women. And this in turn has affected labor supply going back to the productive sphere. In terms of the lockdown channel, the shutdown in local transport, the problems with shortages in supply, the restrictions on mobility, the difficulties in international shipping, all have contributed to the fact that workers have been laid off or furloughed or dismissed, which has affected their employment and income due to the lockdown, which has again affected basic social provisioning in the social reproductive sphere. But this in particular has created a great deal of stress for women in the household, and we see that there's been this exponential rise in domestic violence in particular, and much longer days for women, and these then feed back into the productive sphere through reduced bargaining power for workers. And I'll speak now about each of the individual channels. So to begin with the health channel, and here again we are looking at the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic on well-being. So through workplace contagion, workers have fallen sick, which has led to a loss of income and a decline in consumption, and in particular has affected the agency of women within the household. So here the gendered impacts are displayed using rounded edges. So this is where we really feel like women are differentially impacted. But of course, workplace contagion has also led to labor shortages and factory closures. On the other hand, when household members have become ill with COVID, this has increased care work, particularly for women, and led to reduced time for paid work, increased exhaustion and stress. And in the lockdown channel, here again, we are looking at the impact on well-being, and we have separated this into the two channels of effects that have taken place through supply disruption and those that have taken place through the demand contraction within global value chains. And as I said earlier, lockdown was the result of policies that have affected shipping and restrictions on transport. In the case of supply disruption, there was also the added stress or the added problem of shortage of raw materials, components, and supplies that particularly affected production in global value chains. And I'll start with the supply disruption channel first. So, here, of course, one of the major effects, especially on women workers, was furloughs and dismissals, because women tend to be concentrated in casual, temporary, flexible work, which led to a loss of income, which translates into increased health risk because of the decline in subsistence. For women, this can mean a declining labor force participation, but the loss of income also constitutes a threat to voice and agency for women, which can lead to gender-based violence and again feed into the declining labor force participation. The loss of income also leads to the slide into more precarious forms of work, which has knock-on effects. So both in supply disruption and demand contraction, the furloughs and dismissals were a very important aspect. But in supply disruption, in industries where demand was sustained, there was also a practice of locking down workers at the workplace, which of course poses greater health risk for workers, but also has the risk of violating the right to decent work with increased abuse, harassment, and long working hours. In sectors like business process outsourcing, there was also a shift to a work from home regime pretty quick. And though this brought some benefits for women in terms of combining paid and unpaid work, it also brought other risks, such as greater surveillance and self-exploitation as the boundaries between home and work become more fuzzy, which led to longer working days for women. And it also allowed firms to transfer certain operational risks and costs of operation to workers, which also lowered their net income. And in terms of demand contraction, we see the widespread factory closures that took place in a number of industries within that operate in the global value chain sphere, led to order cancellations by buyers, such as in garments, which also produced a sort of string of effects that I went through already in terms of dismissals and loss of income. But in cases where workers were retained, there were also other problems that were experienced, such as wage cuts, again, workers being exposed to increased health risk because of lack of PPE, lack of social distancing, and an intensification of work and rising insecurity. And these shocks were actually intensified within the structures of global value chains because, of course, they are based on massive trade of intermediate inputs, which makes them very susceptible to supply shocks. So again, the disruptions in air, land, and ocean freight and raw material shortages played a very important role in electronics, as well as in garments early on. And demand shocks also tend to be transmitted more rapidly in global value chains, because when the decline for final goods occurs, it also affects the demand for intermediates, and firms are reluctant to place more orders in an environment of uncertainty and risk, and tend to use existing stocks rather than place new orders. Of course, there is the issue of the dominance and market power of lead firms in the North, which has allowed them to shift these risks and costs to suppliers in the South. And all these together have really compounded the effects on workers. So why have we focused on business process outsourcing and electronics and garments? We believe they provide some interesting variations in terms of geographic distribution, female employment, and technological intensity. So electronics, of course, is highly dispersed geographically, has a very high share of intermediate goods. BPO and garments are much less dispersed. BPO employs a more white-collar, relatively higher educated workforce, and a lot of women are employed in call centers. In electronics, the female share of employment is not as high as it is in garments, but women again are doing assembly type, low value added work. And in terms of technological intensity, electronics is a leader in the adoption of robotics, whereas business process outsourcing is more at the early stages of adopting Industry 4.0, whereas garments really sort of lags in that respect. And perhaps I won't spend too much time on this slide, but the structures of governance.
5 minutes. Thank you.
The structures of governance also vary with garments in particular. There's a huge differential in power and asymmetry across the chains, because most suppliers outside of East Asia are in cut, make, trim operations. Electronics tends to be highly modular in most products, which again entails low market power and profitability for suppliers. And for business process outsourcing, most of the firms are large IT firms headquartered in the North, with a handful of mature Indian firms, and governance varies between being captive, modular, or market. So I'll just go through the three sectors that we looked at. So business process outsourcing was primarily affected by supply disruption, which led to furloughs and layoffs, but these had a gendered impact because women are primarily in insecure and flexible contracts in countries like the Philippines, that has this concept of floating workers, and many women are concentrated in voice-based functions where there was a disproportionate impact. And business process outsourcing is also the sector where working from home has emerged as the new normal. And I've been through the consequences of working from home, so I won't get into it too much. But just to quickly point out that many workers had to bear the cost of high-speed internet connections and electricity. And companies also now prefer to hire new recruits who already own some technical equipment, which again puts women at a disadvantage because they don't own as many assets as men. In garments, it was, of course, demand contraction that was the primary kind of shock that was experienced. And again, this industry is, poster child of the low-wage labor model of economic development. There are people in the audience who've done a lot of work on this. There were huge order cancellations that affected employment of workers in Bangladesh. As Mark Anna has shown, 54% of factories closed down, 2.17 million workers were laid off, and wages were not paid, severance payments were not done. And this has also amplified many other inequalities related to age and migrant workers. Electronics was a combination of supply disruption and demand contraction. There was initially a shortage of semiconductors and chips, but this was intensified because of the decline in demand for consumer electronics and industrial appliances later. So this had a ripple effect down the chain. Many layoffs of workers in Vietnam and Indonesia. Wages were retained where work continued. There was inadequate health precautions, and there have also been retaliatory actions taken by firms to against workers who have been union leaders, and this is becoming increasingly a problem. So just to conclude, sorry, I've rushed through this, but I don't want to be, I don't want to take more time. So we see that each of the sectors has been differentially impacted, and we see that workers who already have low bargaining power now are facing more insecurity and worse. Sorry?
2 minutes, but I see you're at the conclusion. Sorry. Go ahead.
So we see that workers who face greater insecurity, who already have low bargaining power, are facing greater insecurity and worsening conditions of employment. And the pandemic really illustrates and deepens the vulnerabilities that women at the lowest end of global value chains already experience. And here social norms have been very important in segregating women into particular types of jobs, and also making them at the receiving end of some of the impacts. So women have faced not only dramatic job losses, but of course increased burdens of care work, and as I said earlier, rising gender-based violence and mental stress has affected their ability to continue paid work. In the future, we expect that in some industries more than others, like electronics, there appears to be an acceleration of automation, or at least it's expected. And we believe that this might change the cost structures and calculations of firms, that may lead to greater reshoring. And of course, this again places a question mark on how viable the GVC model is going to be as a mode of development, as a development strategy going forward. So I will stop there. So I think hopefully I'm not over time. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. No, you definitely were on time, and brilliant presentation. Thank you very much. Okay, I can see there's already a question, Stephanie.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, Shiva. Thank you. Just read what you touched briefly at the end. Do you have any information on the building back? Because I know in Bangladesh, etc., factories are re-establishing production. Just who's being hired? What are the gender implications of that? And across your sectors?
Yeah, sure. So in Bangladesh, I'm aware that actually the firms, lead firms, are using this occasion to cut prices, to negotiate on prices even more. And there's a 30% decline in unit prices that they have managed to negotiate for this year. So really there's a real profit squeeze going on. So really using the pandemic as an occasion to extract more rents. And the payment schedule has widened. So Mark Anna has done some work on this. So from sort of a normal payment schedule of 44 days, the payment schedule has now increased to 72 days. So they're taking actually more credit from these suppliers, and it looks like this is going to make survival difficult for a number of firms. And in fact, there are some firms that are already running losses. And so it's not clear, actually, there's going to be a real shakeout of firms, it looks like, in the next year or two. The other sort of reports that I've seen across the sectors is actually in electronics is very troubling retaliatory strikes against workers. And we see, Business and Human Rights Coalition putting out numerous reports about union leaders in particular being targeted, and this being an occasion really to reduce wages that are being paid out to workers. This is especially happening in countries in East Asia, Vietnam, and Indonesia, and there are some interesting studies that have been done on this. In business process outsourcing, I think working from home has become the new normal, and I think in business process outsourcing, automation really looks to be more likely than it is in garments. And we see that during the pandemic, that many of the firms that are located in rich countries that are at the forefront of AI technologies have been giving trials and discounts to some of these BPO firms to try out, chatbot technologies and others, that will have labor displacing effects. And we know that women are concentrated or tend to be concentrated in these routinized jobs. So from at least from industry reports, it seems like in the next few years, this automation is going to have quite an important effect on workers in BPOs. So what time period does this study cover? This is based on data from 2020. So we wrote the paper in about mid-2020 and we revised it over time. So we've tried to update it, but it was really in the first few months of the pandemic that most of our research is concentrated.
Thank you very much, Sheba. There's also, I had a question about the framework of the analysis and your multidimensional approach, but I think that's quite broad and addresses other papers too. So maybe I park that for a moment and we get back at the end. So the next presenter is Professor Stephanie Barrientos with a paper on the governance of regional domestic horticulture value chains in Kenya horticulture. You're muted, Stephanie.
Can you see the PowerPoint okay?
Very well, yes.
Last time I gave a paper, my security stopped the PowerPoint sharing, so that's great. Okay, so this is a paper that it's with Magia Pondo and Giovanni Pasquale. I should just say a few words about the research. I'm having the same problem now as everybody else. There we go. A little bit about the research. The key question that we're addressing here is what drives shifts in private and public governance in value chains that intersect with domestic value chains, particularly what are the implications for smallholders with a focus on Kenyan horticulture. This is part of a GCRF ESRC Shifting South research project with UCT and with University of Nairobi. And we were interrupted, we were bang in the middle of research when COVID hit. So we've been focusing during COVID more on standards. The research, the fieldwork in Kenya has been re-established, but it literally is being finished this month. So the analysis of the smallholder piece is much less than we would have liked, but the analysis of the standards is a lot more given the situation. So just the research methodology, I'll give the whole overview, but it's firstly, we did the value chain mapping, both secondary and primary data, a number of key informant interviews, but really focusing in on Kenya. I mean, the key really was to understand what's going on in Kenyan retail and how that is affecting horticultural sourcing and what are the implications for smallholders and workers. We did semi-structured interviews with supermarkets, smallholders, brokers, institutions, various institutions, as well as avocado and green bean processors and workers. The two case studies that we've been using are avocados and green beans. And we also looked at global gap in some detail. We're not presenting on that here. We also did focus group discussions with avocados and green bean smallholders. Plus we did some worker interviews, but those have only recently been completed. So I don't have the findings from those. That is workers for smallholders. Sorry, just want to go the arrow. Okay, so the analytical approaches we used. So firstly, we started from the whole project started from the premise that there's been a big shift in terms of global value chains just because of shifts in trade. So increasingly trade is going from sourcing in the global south to Europe and North America, in horticulture Kenya case largely to Europe, to this increase in trade, south-south trade, and particularly regional trade. By regional, I mean inter-country trade within a particular geographical region, but also increasingly domestic value chains. And I'll go into that in a bit more. Now, we've got a number of different approaches to governance, obviously starting with the work of Gary Gireffi and along with Humphrey and Schmidt and others. But what we've been focusing on is really the more recent advances in the analysis of governance, particularly in relation to multipolar governance, the work of Ponty and Sturgeon, the interlayering of private and public governance, which is the work of Barclay and Alford, etc. And we've put a lot of focus now more recently in the analysis of standards on power and the way power evolves in global value chains, particularly applying this because a lot of the analysis of governance of powers is focused on global value chains. What are the implications when you shift to the analysis of regional and domestic value chains, which is really our main focus? And we've been drawing on the work of Dallas and others, looking at dyadic, diffuse and collective forms of power, direct and diffuse it should be. And what we're looking at is the implications when you have this intersection of global value chains and domestic value chains, but very importantly, that overlap increasingly, and this we'll come to in a minute, with domestic, more traditional domestic markets, local markets. And for that, we've advanced this concept of polycentric governance, building on the above. And particularly what we've identified through this is what we call the governance void, which occurs when you've got governance, both private governance, social governance, civil society, state governance, but when you have intersecting global and domestic value chains that also interlink with open markets, and that certainly through the empirical research is what we found, and where those overlap and intersect, effectively what we're arguing in relation to polycentric governance is that even for the lead firms, the lead global firms, that diffuses their power. Whilst they might have quite strong dyadic power with their immediate suppliers, it undermines the power that they have within the wider value chain. And that is especially in connection with the domestic value chains, but also, and you'll see the reason why we're arguing this, even further undermined in relation to open markets. And that is why there's been a shift, and I'll go into that now, in Kenya towards what we call collective forms of governance, but particularly parallel private public governance. So just a quick few, these are all Kenyan supermarkets, and you'll see the various key producers. For anyone who knows South Africa, Dutoy is one of the leading fruit exporters out of South Africa. Their produce goes into Kenyan supermarkets, but also into the local wet markets. So that's just a little bit on the Kenya context. I haven't got time now. I did give a presentation last year, an earlier version of this paper at SASI, and that went more into the retail transformation. But there's been a massive retail transformation in Kenya, the decline of the Kenyan supermarkets, particularly the demise of Nakumatt and Uchumi, and the entry just in the last 5 or so years of big international players, particularly Carrefour and Game, which is under Walmart. And what we found when we mapped these chains, or the sourcing of these chains, is that there are key suppliers of horticulture, but we focused in on beans and avocados, that are going into the global value chains. Many of those suppliers are now also supplying the domestic supermarkets, and that was the example or the pictures you just saw. The bit that they don't tell you about officially, but if you really map your value chain and do the deep, more in-depth interviews, is that actually that is leading to supply coming in from the local markets. The horticulture sector in Kenya is quite large. It's 18.5% of exports, but very importantly, the vast majority of producers, particularly in vegetables, less so in flowers, are smallholders, and smallholders play a key role. In the value chain literature, there was sort of different views expressed early on with the growth of standards in value, on the growth of global value chains, whether smallholders would be excluded from export. And Dolan and Humphrey and others argued that they would. But more recent research, particularly by Uma, Dannenberg and others, has shown that smallholders, even though officially they might not be entering into the value chain, their produce is indirectly entering in through one source or another. And our research confirmed that as well. In other words, where from the produce that would traditionally have been destined for local markets is not only going into the domestic supermarkets, which source from both the big producers and smallholders, but also finding its way into the global value chains indirectly. So this has led in Kenya to two major crises, this kind of diffusion, if you like. Firstly, the MRL crisis, that was the minimum residue levels. The EU really clamped down on Kenya because it kept getting imports coming in from Kenya with excess residue levels, pesticides, etc. But also, and very importantly, a health crisis, domestic health crisis within Kenya, increased rates of cancer associated with use of pesticides in food production. And I can't remember which it was, but leading politicians, families were also affected by this. So there's two crises that really came together. Now the two crises led to, so you've had, and I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail, global value chains have high levels of standards that operate particularly in EU markets. So you've got both EU regulation, used to apply to the UK, not anymore, sorry, that was an aside, EU regulation, which was where the MRL violations got hit, but also higher than EU regulation are supermarket standards. And supermarket standards are global GAP, the ETI code, GRASP, which covers work. Global GAP covers largely product and process and traceability. ETI code covers mainly workers, and GRASP smallholder workers. And then you've got the sort of Fair Trade Rainforest Alliance. These are the main standards that the European supermarkets use a variation of. Smallholders in that situation or in that context are certified, but usually through small producer organizations, which in Kenya is largely cooperatives and self-help groups. Kenya GAP was put forward as a local variation of global GAP to encourage to relate to smallholders, but it didn't fly. Once you had the MRL crisis combined with the health crisis, the Kenyan government really then stepped in, and you already had national regulation involving the horticultural crop development and involving the Kenya Bureau of Standards and a number of other organizations. But what they did they'd had already on the potential, but really about 3 to 4 years ago, around 2018, 2019, they brought in a code, KS1758, which is a national code, public regulation, implemented by HCD, but under the Ministry of Agriculture, which all producers are meant to, at least in the long run, comply with. Now, the key to KS 1758 is, if you read it, it is basically a virtual rip-off, or sorry, I didn't use that word. It's a complete reflection of a combination of Global GAP, Kenya GAP, ETI-based code, and Rainforest Alliance. In other words, what they've done is to take the private sector codes and integrate a version of that into public regulation. So this isn't traditional public regulation or previous, this is really a new form. Key to it is the issue of traceability. That for them is certainly in the rollout, and it is relatively recent. So we were doing the research as KS 1758 was being rolled out. All global exports, it's now a requirement, although because of part of the rollout, they accept global GAP as the equivalent of, but from now on, all exporters out of Kenya have to also be KS 1758 compliant. All the Kenyan supermarkets, the domestic value chains, are meant to be KS 1758 compliant, certainly in relation to traceability. But part of the rollout, whether or not this will extend to local markets, in theory, yes, in reality, no. The extent to which this is being rolled out to smallholders it's happening in process. So the last round of fieldwork, which literally is just finished in June, we did come across or heard of some smallholder groups that were being inspected in relation to KS 1758. I should say that the focus of it has been on product and process standards, not on social standards. So just briefly in relation to the case study, which is ongoing. So case study was of peas and bees and avocados. We chose those two, partly they both have a high percentage of smallholders in them, but also peas and beans are traditionally an export crop, which is increasingly being sold in domestic supermarkets and even markets. Avocados are traditionally a domestic crop, which is increasingly being exported and sent into global value chains. So it gave us a kind of a comparison. Very high levels of smallholders in both. We were also quite interested in the gender profile of production and land tenure, and that there is a whole other paper which I'm working on. Maggie and others are involved in looking on the gender dimension. 2 minutes, fine. But very importantly, in Kenya, as I mentioned, the smallholders are organised through self-help groups and cooperatives. There are also individual farmers, and that is the way in which the government requires and gives support to smallholders to comply with codes both through Global Gap, but also now through KS 1758. So the government also plays an important role there. So just very briefly, our kind of, this really is ongoing analysis, and I really need to caveat that because we've only just literally received the sort of breakdown of the final interviews, etc. But we see very clear differences between the global value chain, domestic, and the local markets. So in the global value chain, direct sourcing, smallholder groups are organized, they are certified, there's training that goes on, and with some exceptions, they have more stable incomes and livelihoods. In the domestic value chain, there's a combination. The domestic supermarkets say they only source through key brokers, but when we really did the field work, we found that they are sourcing through direct suppliers, but also via brokers and intermediaries. So it's a much more mixed picture, even the international supermarkets. Therefore, the standards are very mixed, the training's very mixed, it's limited, and it's very varied outcomes. But in the traditional market, still dominated by brokers, no standards, no support, no training, very insecure, and really being pushed down on price by intermediaries. So just to wrap up, so we were really looking at this intersection of the global, domestic, and local. But also looking at the way that the spillover from the one through to the other is leading to an undermining of standards, even in the global markets, reflected in the MRL and health crises. And what we're arguing in relation to this concept of polycentric governments is that governance essentially there's been a diffusion of lead firm power, even in the global markets. They're at risk of this spillover coming into their value chains. That's been leading to a value chain void, what we call a value chain void, and that's prompted this rise of collective governments, particularly through KS 1758. But I think two things about that. Firstly, we're calling that polycentric governance rather than interlayered, because this is proper private governance now made public rather than simply traditional. And secondly, I mean, obviously this is an ongoing process. We also have questions about the scope and sustainability of this in the longer run. But polycentric means the two will work in parallel as different forms of pressure, if you like, for standards to be rolled out in Kenya. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And I can see there's already a question by Søren, if you want to ask it directly.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, and of course also related to our paper as Peter presented it. Apart from the, you can say, legislation itself and the copying of the private things into the public, What are the Kenyan government agencies doing, if they're doing anything in terms of training and assisting the smallholders, etc.?
Yes, and Giovanni, you can also come in here because you were doing some of the interviews. We've just done follow-up interviews with specifically with the standards agencies, in fact. Yes, no, they are. I mean, that obviously it wasn't just our research that got hit by COVID, but also the rollout of KS1758 got hit by the rollout by COVID. So you had the two going together. But certainly the HCD plays a particular role in the export sector. That's easier because that is monitored by they already had an important role, and it's larger exporters, larger firms that do the exports, so they're easier to work with, I would argue. KEFIS is the one that has also played a role. Do you want in domestically? Do you want to just go into that briefly, Gio? Yeah,
absolutely. In fact, COVID stopped that process for a bit, and now it is restarting, which is training on a sort of quite mass scale of farmers, and also supporting organizing them in self-help groups in cases where this is not the case by 3 institutions. HCD is coordinating it. There's a major role played by CalRO. For those of you who are familiar with the Kenyan environment, is a training institution, research institutions that directly works with the government on these issues, and they design the training material, and they're also conducting part of the training, and together with KEFIS, which is a phytosanitary authority, which is also carrying out trainings, but importantly conducting tests. And now more and more, though it's still at a random base now, so it's not systematic, in local markets, but most importantly in supermarkets. So the concept there is start from the supermarket, formal supermarket retailers, make sure that everything they do is according to the KS1758, and then slowly move into the domestic, like the market-based sort of open market. Carlos, I see you have.
Thanks.
Hi, is it my turn? Thanks, everyone.
Yes.
Oh, thanks. Just a question on unpacking the category of smallholder farmers, because it's clearly a very, very broad category, especially in these sectors that are quite demanding in terms of quality requirements and so on. So can you tell us something about what particular categories, fractions of the smallholder farming population you saw, whether there's any differences between those who managed to sell to more sort of global value chains versus domestic value chains? Because I think this characterization of different kinds of smallholders, I mean, some of them are, micro capitalist farmers in reality, whether you can unpack that somehow. Thank you.
No, I definitely very important. So to formally to go into the global value chain, you have to be in a smallholder group. You have to be in an SBO of some form or another. And in Kenya, it's certainly in the 2 crops we were looking at, it was more predominantly cooperatives in AVOs and smallholder groups in beans and peas. So that one's clear cut, or supposed to be clear cut, because of the certification is only done of smallholder groups, and that was driven by Global Gap. The domestic range, so for the domestic supermarkets, and that also goes back to the previous question, this is obviously Chatham, hopefully this is Chatham House rules, we're going to have to be a bit careful how we write this. We were told by all the leading domestic supermarkets that they only source through recognised buyers and suppliers, and therefore, of course, that means that they can demonstrate to HCD that they have full traceability and they know. When we went and interviewed smallholders, we found it was a much more mixed picture than that, and they were also sourcing through other channels. So some, and the Kenyan government has been very proactive, separately from the standards issue. I didn't have time to go into it, in promoting smallholder organisation as a means of, particularly in self-help groups, especially. There's a whole issue tied up with the Constitution. So that's a process that's ongoing, and the government has been given quite a lot of support to building of smallholder groups, and plays a role in negotiating between the small HCD at the local level, negotiating between smallholder groups or self-help groups and buyers. I'm less of a proactive role in the cooperatives, but you can see a process of shift going on, and that's been a strategy of the government. But as you indicate, there are a large number, particularly who supply the traditional market, which are very diverse, very fragmented. Some, you know, I can't remember the exact hectare size for a definition of smallholder group in Kenya. It's just not on the top of my tongue, but some are larger, I mean, that effectively fall into that. Some are more entrepreneurial, but many are really semi-subsistence farmers. And in terms of the profiling those three groups, when we did the research, we looked for, deliberately tried to stratify between the different types. So some of the interviews were with these very diverse, isolated, largely working through intermediaries. Some of the interviews were with cooperatives and SHGs in terms of the profiling of self-help groups. And definitely the isolated ones were the ones that were less, I mean, they were just really exposed to the intermediaries and very insecure. So the interesting thing there would be how successful as well the Kenya government is in encouraging the formation of SHGs and or cooperatives in order to comply with KS 1758. So that, I mean, it's too early to know, but that is certainly a process ongoing.
Thank you very much. So we have now about 15, even 20 minutes. We can go over a little bit, that's no problem, for a general discussion. So let me thank everybody for their papers, and please feel free to come in to make a general comment, ask questions. I have a few, but I would rather leave first to the audience to discuss and ask their questions if they have any. So please go ahead, feel free. All right, yeah, go ahead, Matt. Yeah.
I mean, I think thanks firstly for the fantastic presentations. I really enjoyed them, and there were definitely some cross-cutting themes. And without wanting to revisit some of the discussion too much that we had yesterday, but perhaps for obvious reasons, and maybe this applies most to Stephanie's, Peter's, Soren's work, but also others. It's just this rethinking of the role of the state and government when we see this shift from the global to the regional domestic value chains, where production and purchasing is taking place more within the kind of territorial confines of a particular country or region. So just asking Stephanie, Soren, Peter, and other authors to reflect a bit on that and what it might mean for the governance of social and other standards. So a bit of a broad one, but I think that the papers really prompted me to think, relate what we saw here to yesterday and continue that discussion. Thanks.
Okay, if there are no other comments, we can probably have a brief round with the presenters. Carlos, I see you raise your hand, so you can go first. You're muted.
Sorry, I was just going through the chat and I could see some unanswered questions there. And then maybe we can pick up on Matthew's question as well. I could see Sheba's question on the reactions from enterprises to this militancy. Actually, there hasn't really been relocation. It was quite interesting how especially I'm talking here about foreign, the newly established foreign investors, how they seemed pretty cool about some of these problems. I mean, they're always concerned, but they were mostly thinking about, how to deal with turnover, thinking about that turnover wouldn't be such a big problem in 5 years' time. So they had this medium-term outlook, which wasn't particularly alarmed. If there is a reason for and that's also because you have different different orders of problems in Ethiopia at the moment, as you can imagine. If there is one reason for potential relocation now, is the sheer sense of insecurity at the moment and the political volatility of the country. And that was indeed one of the questions that came up very frequently when interviewing managers, that questions of workplace bargaining, labor conflicts, strikes, etc., were seen as normal, that could be managed, that could be negotiated somehow. However, political instability and violence was a completely different game. And for some of these enterprises, clearly, if the situation deteriorated, as it has in the last year or so, relocation is a clear possibility for some of them, and indeed it has happened. And there was also a question, I can't remember now, on the targeting, I think it was Matthew, on targeting lead firms. I mean, we were talking about leading firms in Ethiopia, not so much the lead firms in the global production networks. So the targeting was really to the what you could call flagship firms, very visible, especially in media, very much reported in the media, local media especially, and not all of them in industrial parks. In fact, there was one particularly important firm that was outside these parks, and they were routinely targeted, and very often this targeting was closely linked to local political mobilizations. And one of the reasons was not only because these firms were flagship, well-known, etc., but also some of them were actually protected by the military, by the federal police forces. So in a sense, they became sort of outposts of this federal authority and easy targets. So that's for the lead firms in global production networks. I mean, there's an interesting story there, but it might be a bit too long. Is that some of the industrial parks, at least two of them, are linked to actual lead firms like PVH. Hawaasa Industrial Park is linked to PVH, and then there's also the H&M Industrial Park. But we didn't really see a connection between these mobilization strikes and this sort of more active discourses and reference to the international buyers directly. Not at that point. I'll stop there.
If I can just quickly ask, if you don't mind, Carlos,
Yeah.
It would be really interesting to hear your reflections on why there's so much militancy in Ethiopia
Yes.
compared to other countries. I'm really interested in your view on that. Yeah.
I mean, Florian, if you want, we've got the work by Andreas Admasie, who's done work on the history of labor militancy in Ethiopia. So there is a history that goes back to the imperial times. And it goes in waves, it has gone in waves, and the argument would be that we seem to see a new wave, which is partly connected, obviously, to the arrival of these new industrial investors. And the paradox is that this happens even though union density is not particularly high. And that was a general complaint, a general concern among union officials was, how difficult it was to penetrate industrial parks to get membership in the apparel sector. And yet, you had this labor militancy outside union organizations. So there's a history behind, and also I think it goes back to the question of local political conflict and how labor grievances and local political conflicts are intertwined, quite often. And it's not new. I mean, this is not the first time that this kind of combination happens. It has happened also, for example, in the 1970s. There's some similar examples. Florian, do you want to add anything to this?
No, I think you've covered it. Thank you.
You mute.
I think you've covered it fine. Thank you very much.
Søren, I can see you raise your hand.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for the input. So just following on, but also the comment I raised earlier, because I think it's interesting with these differences in unions and workers' resistance. Because if we look at the Southern African context that I've been involved with there with my colleague Andres Bezuidenhout, when we look at Lesotho and Eswatini and South Africa, there's a lot about this is tied politically. So it's an avenue to become a union member or organizer into politics, for sure in Lesotho. but we also see it in various forms. But at the factory level, we tend to see it, a rather different picture, that there's much less resistance, so to speak, and you can say maybe more of a need in terms of having these very meager earnings there. So people with not really want to give up on their jobs and the few earnings that they get. So it plays out sort of in a rather different form. And then secondly, on the public governance, I think it's interesting also with this from Kenya, and thank you very much for the presentations, Stephanie. Look forward to read more on that. But that you can say the government there is also becoming much more active at a local level, which we have seen, for instance, in India. I think the big question, also coming to what Matthew asked about, is how far does sort of the government stretches, because in India, of course, rather complex setup, as you will know, and there are many levels and layers. And what we tend to see, as Peter also explained in the presentation, is that, well, there is an issue about the last mile, and that being from the slightly bigger cities or urban centers to the villages. And yeah, that one of the explanation is that, well, you know, the laws and the schemes and the programs are there, but there's not really sort of any implementation going on locally. Sort of the whatever appointed person sits in his typically or her office, they're not moving out, they're not engaging, and that creates a bit of this particular gap and situation that Peter also explained for these female micro entrepreneurs in that setting. But I think there are some really interesting issues in terms of what are the local governments doing, because as we know, it's not enough that they're just doing things. It may be better than nothing, but what are they focusing on? So I think that's something that we should look further into as we move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah, no, just thank you. I just wanted to pick up a bit more on this gender dimension, because I thought your response was really interesting, and to my question earlier, and particularly that sexual harassment is a big issue, and as you say, it's in multiple forms. I mean, it can just take the form of shouting, but it is this largely male supervisors supervising largely female workers. And as you said, the big issue in Ethiopia, I don't research Ethiopic garments specifically, but I do kind of follow it from afar, and the big issue is labour turnover as well as resistance, and that's actually I know from the buyers, because I interview them at this end, that's a major problem for them. Just the point I wanted to raise, though, is I mean, I draw on labour process theory similar to you, but I just find it, and labour regimes to a lesser extent, but particularly labour process theory, and I just do find, and value chain theory both, equal criticism of both, is they just don't deal with the gender dimension very well, if at all sometimes, and when they do, not very well. So I think that there is a kind of analytical challenge for all of us using this approach, and I do use it, by the way, so it's not in ensuring that we bring that gender dimension in, because so often it just gets overlooked, analytically as well as empirically. But it was great to hear your response, because that was very interesting. Yes.
Carlos, do you have a comment on this?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Stephanie. It's not only about bringing the gender dimension; it's just that it should be central to the discussion, precisely because the way we characterize a certain labor control regimes are very much embedded in existing gender relations, and I think that there is increasing work within, I mean, with people who use labor process theory, but also who pay a lot of attention to questions of social reproduction in making this part of the center of the analysis. And indeed, this is also something that we strive to get. I just wanted to add a comment on the issue of the role of the state and in relation to our own experience in the research, because I think it's, for us, it was fascinating to see how once you start unpacking that big animal, the state, you realize all the multiple contradictions and shifts that happen even in short periods of time that can only be explained through a clear analysis of shifting political settlements in the country. So Florian mentioned the increasing friction between the subnational, i.e. the regional governments, the local governments, and the federal government. And this came up very, very clearly in the analysis, especially towards the more recent period, 2018-19. And what that shows is that once you unpack the state, you can see how different parts of that state take different sides in the capital-labor relation, very much contingent on other political struggles, other ongoing political struggles. So it's very difficult to actually disentangle what is specific to capital labor struggles and what is specific to internal political factionalist struggles. So that's why, very often, and this then is clearly reflected in how foreign managers respond to questions about the role of the state and how the state is supporting or not foreign investment in these countries. And what you see in some of the responses is this sense of contradiction. They say, well, we don't really know what's going on, whether the state is on our side or not. Sometimes we do see it, sometimes we don't. What happens in the labor courts is very different from what happens when we have a very big strike or when we get attacked by a group of political organizations, local political organizations. So this sense of lack of clarity can only be explained if we really unpack the state into its different components. And I think that's something that may have wider implications for research in other places, because I'm sure that Ethiopia is not unique in this sense.
Peter had a comment in the chat about that. Does he want to come in on it?
Yeah, so I mean, I was listening a little bit to the discourse and the discussion, and I was thinking that this idea about the public, private, and social governance and the relationship between these different types of governance and how that changes over time and how that changes as we move across different scales from international to national, state, provincial, or local levels might be interesting as a kind of framing of understanding the role of the state in value chains. So that was just a broad sort of observation.
I would like to ask maybe Sheba if you want to comment on this, because Peter's point connects a lot with you coming from a gender perspective and the impact of COVID-19 in value chains. You clearly develop a new analytical framework there. But all across the papers we have heard about, talk about multidimensional, multiscalarity, polycentric governance. Florian talked about the micro, meso, and national levels. So we have this interlayering of different levels, and it seems to me it's not really synergistic, as the the GVC literature has been telling us for a while. Is really a lot of tensions, a lot of contingencies playing around and determining specific outcomes. So I don't know whether you want to comment on that and tell us whether do we need a new framework completely to look at these new changing geographies of trade and how COVID-19 is impacting, or is the old framework still good? And yeah.
Sure, thank you for that question. And I'd also take maybe a chance to answer to Peter's question, which I realize I missed earlier. And what we try to do in the framework is not really to kind of drill down into individual effects. We're rather using the individual effects to create a more general framework, right? So the pathways that we've created are stylized pathways that show the general sort of differences between processes and outcomes, or they show rather the process that leads to the outcome. So it's a more generalized framework. So it's not to say that there are no differences between geographic contexts, and of course there are, but this is really a way to think about what's happening in terms of the gender dimension of the impact of COVID, and it's sort of like a research agenda. And I have to say, I share Stephanie's frustration with the GVC literature, because I feel like there is a lot of interesting theoretical work happening here, and the gender dimension really does seem to be missing. Even, I'm really interested in the labor control regime analysis. And again, here, my question would be, what would happen if you really inserted gender as a central variable? Usually our discussion of gender is just characterizing workers as female. Yes, they're female workers and there is a sexual abuse and sexual harassment or something else. But what if we really center that as, very important categorical difference that really structures the global value chain? So, I don't know exactly to what extent we would need to revise our frameworks. Of course, I think the global value chain framework is very important and really focuses on the role of power, on the role of profits, and on asymmetries. But I feel like it misses some of the other asymmetries that are very important for some categories of workers. So I would also like to see much more of that. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. If there are any other comments, please feel free. Otherwise, I think it's a good moment to close our discussion. Okay, we're about 5 minutes over time. It has been a great discussion. I'd like to remind everybody that our panel is not over. At 2:15, we will have another session, which is mostly discussing trade, but again, there will be aspects of public governance and also labor that are going to come out from some of the papers we have later. So I really invite you to come and join us later for the last and final session of the conference. I would also like to thank Stephanie, Khalid, Matthew for co-hosting this, and all the presenters for the brilliant presentations. Very interesting. Thank you very much, and I'll see you later.